Hello and welcome to the first Alnwick Castle Podcast of 2023. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And on today's episode, we're looking at a part of British history that had a major impact in the north of England and especially across Scotland, the Jacobite uprisings of the 18th century.
These aren't events we normally talk about much at Alnwick Castle. They happened at a time when the Percy family weren't living here, and the castle itself was basically unused. But that doesn't mean there's no connection.
We spoke to Jacobite historian and curator of modern and contemporary history at the National Museum of Scotland, Georgia Vullinghs, to find out more about the people, the period, and the items associated with the Jacobites.
Please enjoy the episode.
We are very happy to be joined on the Alnwick Castle podcast today by Jacobite historian and expert from the National Museum of Scotland, Georgia Vullinghs. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast and considering me as a Jacobite expert. That's an honour.
We should probably start with a little bit about you and how you came to know so much about the Jacobites.
So the Jacobites I have sort of known about for a long time as part of my education in Scotland. I think it's an important, well-known part of the history in Scotland. But I really came to study it as part of my PhD at the University of Edinburgh in collaboration with National Museum of Scotland. So I thought that was a really good way to do some research into the topic, specifically on the material culture of the Jacobites and Jacobite exile from 1716 to 1760, using the collections at the museum, and then also some archival records in the royal collection known as the Stuart Papers. So that's how I got into the subject, really.
Obviously, you mentioned that in Scotland, Jacobite history is a well-known part of the education, but in England it's not. So could you just explain who the Jacobites were?
Of course, yes. So the Jacobites are the name for the supporters of James II of England in Scotland, James VII, and his descendants, his direct male descendants, to claim the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland. So Jacobites comes from the Latin for Jacobus, which is James. So that gives the background to the names. And why did they need to support him? Well, in 1688, when James II was king, there were some concerns about the fact that he was a Catholic monarch, amongst other things. And with the birth of a male heir, Prince of Wales, a group of 7 elite Englishmen and others asked that his daughter and son-in-law, Mary and William of Orange from the Netherlands, who were Protestants, would come and depose him and take his place to rule. So obviously James II wasn't very happy about this, and there were people who continued to support him at that time, and this is known as the Glorious Revolution by some, so the time at which James II was deposed. There were some battles immediately after that in Scotland and in Ireland in particular. So there was a war to try and restore James, but it was never successful. And ultimately, the Stuarts, that particular branch of the Stuart family, never regained their throne. Although people continued to support them and be loyal to them well into the middle of the 18th century, and then kind of more culturally and emotionally into the 19th century. So I've mentioned James II. His son, James Francis Edward Stuart, was then known to the Jacobites as James III. Another figure that you might have heard of is Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. So he was the next generation of Jacobite kings. And he also had a brother, Henry Benedict Stuart. So I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about them all in detail, but I hope that gives a bit of an introduction. And the other important thing I should say is that the Stuarts, they weren't executed or killed like Charles I in the 17th century, but they fled into exile. So first to France, where they established a royal court near to Paris, a place called Saint-Germain. And then latterly, the court had to move further away to Italy. And finally, it was established in Rome, where they received papal patronage. And the court stayed there until the death of Henry, the last of the line.
But there were a couple of times where they tried to come back to the British Isles.
Yes.
The dates I remember are 1715 and 1745. Could you tell us a little bit about those years and why they're important?
Definitely. So after 1688, 89 into the 1690s, some fighting, there was some peace. There was a sort of planned attempted rising in 1708, which had to do with the Act of Union of Parliaments between Scotland and England in 1707, but that failed. So the next rising that really came to something, rebellion plan that came to something, was 1715. And this was essentially in response to the Hanoverian dynasty taking over the throne after the death of Queen Anne, who was still a descendant, still a daughter of James II. So to some Stuart supporters, she was more palatable. This new Hanoverian line, who were ultimately still Stuarts, you can go and look up a family tree, they were less palatable to some. So in 1715, there was a rising of Jacobites, of pro-Stuart supporters, led largely by the Earl of Mar, who kind of proclaimed James III as king up in Braemar at a gathering of elite Scottish noblemen. And there was also kind of gathering of activity in the southern Scotland, around the border region, and in northern England, which I think where the story with connection with Alnwick Castle comes in a bit more. I'm not really a military historian, but to give you a rough outline then of that rebellion and how it came about, there were murmurings, there was a bit of plotting and planning. The idea, Mar's plan and the plans of these pro-Stuart noblemen, was that there would be kind of multiple pockets of rising military activity, which would stretch the ability of the government forces to put it down, and therefore would hopefully then make a successful taking over of rule. Ultimately, it didn't work out that successfully. The various points of rebellion kind of popped up in their own time, and then because they were quite spread out, there was some uncertainty as to who should meet where and where their forces should best coalesce. So I mentioned the Earl of Mar was up in Braemar, and there was fighting kind of in the north of Scotland around the Stirling area was significant. And then you also have these Scottish border elite meeting up with those that are in the north of England, northeast of England in particular. And they marched down to Preston, which they thought they'd be able to capture and then ward off the government forces. But ultimately, the Jacobites were forced to surrender at Preston, and many of their leaders were captured at that point. I'll come back, I think, to some of the detail there so we can focus a little bit on Alnwick, but just to give you a sense of the kind of difference maybe between the 1715 and then a later rebellion, the 1745. So this was very much started in Scotland. The idea was that there would also be an English rising with support coming from France across the Channel into England, but this never materialised. So you have a Highland rising marching down to take Edinburgh very swiftly, and then moving southward through Britain, just kind of marching on almost unstoppable until Derby, where they heard of the government troops coming, and there was some uncertainty about where other Jacobite forces were coming from. The French and the English never seemed to materialise properly. So at that point, the Jacobite army turned round and marched back up to Scotland, where they were ultimately defeated at the very famous Battle of Culloden. And this is the rising that Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Charles Edward Stuart, led, and really has become quite a famous character in history because of that. The 1715 should really have been led by James III, but he didn't arrive to Scotland until early 1716, and it was clear by that point that the rising was over, and he quickly turned round again and fled with Mar back to the continent. So I think that's part of the history as well, is that James III has got less of that story. He's less of a hero figure, maybe less charismatic in that historical memory, in the way that Bonnie Prince Charlie was on British soil at the head of the army, and he really became a figurehead for the cause.
So you mentioned Alnwick and the connection there, which was that the Earl of Derwentwater actually owned a house opposite the castle. So can you tell me who he was?
Yes, so the Earl of Derwentwater is a really important figure in the 1715 rising. James Radcliffe That was his name. He was the third Earl, and he was actually the son of one of Charles II's illegitimate daughters. So he was related to the Stuarts by blood. And as a young man, kind of as a teenager, he was asked to attend the exiled Stuart court in France to be a companion to James III. So they had a close relationship, and he's kind of from an early age set up to be a Jacobite, to be a loyal supporter of the Stuart dynasty. So by 1714, I think it was, he returned to England, to the northeast, where him and his family were from, where they had their estates and their house. And when it came then to the 1715 rising, he was considered as one of the most important figures to raise troops, support, resources, funds for the cause. And part of the reason that he's so important is that he is a notable Catholic, English Catholic. And that's not the only reason, but it's a significant reason why some people supported the Stuarts, because of their shared faith and because of the restrictions against Catholics in England and Scotland at that time. He also was wealthy and powerful, and therefore you want him on your side if you're going to stage a rebellion. So the Earl of Derwentwater raised his troops, but he didn't lead the army. That was Thomas Foster, who came from Bamborough Castle, just a bit further up the road. But together they took the kind of northeast of England troops down to Preston and were both captured after the Battle of Preston. And the Earl of Derwentwater is one of the key Jacobite peers, so the really elite nobleman of the Jacobite hierarchy, who was put on trial, kept at the Tower of London, and ultimately executed for his part in the rising. And these trials sometimes are called show trials. They were really making a statement about the government putting down this rebellion, but they also are quite significant for giving those Jacobites a chance to speak in public. So these speeches, the kind of execution platform speeches, are an opportunity for them to make a statement as to why they're loyal to the Stuarts and to kind of pledge their undying loyalty, even though during the trials they sort of tried to apologise and plead guilty in the hope that they'd have a lesser sentence, which didn't work. So after his execution, the Earl of Derwentwater was seen as something of a martyr of the Jacobite cause, and then also, in a really interesting way, martyr of Catholicism in particular. And if I may tell you about a really interesting object, it's a bedsheet, which is now in the Museum of London, and it was embroidered by the Earl of Derwentwater's wife, Anne Radcliffe, after his execution. And the bedsheet is meant to have come from the Tower of London. It's meant to be the sheet that he slept in just before his execution, and it is embroidered using hair. And analysis that's been done on this bed sheet suggests that there might be two different hairs in there, so we might suggest that they're Anne's and James's woven in together. And so we think about what this object is and what it means. I think it's a really personal moment of reflection for Anne on the execution of her husband, to create something special, to create something which remembers him. But it's also very much a relic of that individual who has died for a cause as a martyr. And just to bring that more specifically then into the Catholic context, because I think we can have more general secular relics, Jacobite relics, but specifically Catholic relics. Anne, after James Radcliffe's execution, went to Louvain in what's now Belgium, and she stayed at a convent, and it was there that she did a lot of this embroidery, and she gave some possessions and relics of the Earl of Derwentwater to the convent. So it becomes a kind of hub of Jacobite Catholic exile, all in one place together, and these things intertwine. So I think that's really interesting.
And your speciality is kind of material culture and items and objects and things like that. So for the supporters, were these physical objects a way to keep things going? It wasn't just the belief in a king in France or in Rome or something like that. They had physical things to hold on to these beliefs with.
Yeah, that's a way that I think is important to think about it. So there's a whole host of different types of objects that we might call Jacobite material culture, from medals that were produced by the exile court carrying the portraits of the royal family and usually some kind of heroic message or some suggestion of future restoration or future plans. So it's sort of propaganda in a way. It's often seen as it's the Stuarts saying, "Don't worry, we'll be back. We're proper monarchs. We're proper kings. We know what to do. This isn't the end." But I think it's also a really important communication tool. Again, not just about the communicating the message, but communication and connection between the monarch in France or Rome and then their loyal supporters in Britain. It's a way of feeling like you're in contact and knowing them as well. There's this phrase, look, love, and follow. So the idea that you might look at a portrait on a medal or maybe a painted portrait or an engraved portrait, and you would be able to recognize the Stuarts. And by looking at them, that you would love them. You would know who they were, not just by face, but you would know what kind of character they were as well. And these portraits, then you find them on jewellery. So that's another added layer of connection. You might be wearing this portrait around your neck, close to your heart, or maybe on a ring on your finger, sometimes on snuff boxes. So the kind of tobacco type product that's kept in a little box. And you get these portraits of the Stuarts on boxes as well. A lot of this material had to be secretive. It was ultimately treasonous. It was sedition to be a Jacobite, to openly proclaim support for the Stuarts. So the objects and their meanings are often coded. That's not to say that people didn't recognise them, even if they weren't a Jacobite supporter, but it means that they were sort of beyond prosecution. And one of the most famous Jacobite symbols is the rose, is a white rose. And you see that being used in kind of popular celebrations. People would wear white roses on certain days to celebrate the Stuart dynasty, but also engraved on things like glasses, which they might toast the Stuarts with. Often they're toasting the king over the water. So there are all sorts of words that you can say that are kind of secretively or covertly Jacobite, but also action. So sometimes people would toast over a bowl of water to suggest this king who is over the water. What other objects can I think of?
Well, going back to portraits, in the collection of the first Duchess of Northumberland, within a few decades of the 1745 uprising, are a couple of portraits or drawings of Bonnie Prince Charlie.
Yes.
But she was not a Jacobite. The Duchess of Northumberland, from her diaries, is very much loyal to King George II, the king on the throne at the time. So were they of historical interest, even if you weren't a Jacobite, to have these portraits of famous figures like that?
I think so, and that the word famous figures, I think, is ultimately who they were to a lot of people. The Stuarts were well known, obviously. They are central to kind of ideas about Britain at this time, whether that's because you're pro-Stuart or whether because you're anti-Stuart and these events are happening around you. And the fact that the Duchess had one of these portraits much later after the Jacobite risings isn't particularly strange. I think people were collecting these sorts of things, collecting portraits of famous figures. But we also might say there's, for some, this kind of retrospective connection with the Stuarts. In particular, am I right in understanding that the Earls of Northumberland were famously a Catholic dynasty, as it were? So they might have that connection to the kind of exiled Catholics, even if in the time they didn't actually support them.
Yeah, the Percys were known as Catholics right up until really an uprising in favour of Mary, Queen of Scots, that led to the Earl being beheaded, the Countess having to flee over to modern day Belgium, the next Earl of Northumberland being killed in the Tower of London, and then the gunpowder plot happening in 1605. That's the point where their Catholic beliefs seem to end, but even now they still have that reputation as being a Catholic family. I think we get a lot of visitors who ask if they're still Catholic 400 years later. So that reputation's definitely followed the Percys around.
That's interesting.
But going back to the Duchess of Northumberland, we've got letters in our archive to her mother from 1745 talking about the news of events in Scotland and the Jacobites rising up in that year, almost as it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
How did people further afield find out what was going on? Did it depend what side they supported as to what news they heard?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I understand, I don't think it would necessarily depend on what side you supported as to what news you heard. This would be channels of gossip and conversation would be passing this on. An army marching through the town is not going to go unnoticed, and this would quickly pass on to neighbouring areas, warning that they're coming, this is what's happening. And then also, newspapers would have been reporting these sorts of events and also kind of reporting on the Stuarts in exile as well, even in times when there weren't active rebellions, there weren't active plots. For example, the funeral of the Jacobite queen, Maria Clementina Sobieska, was published in a journal in Dublin and in London. So there was interest in what they're doing. Going back to how people might hear about this, they also would be kind of broadsides, pamphlets, printed satirical engravings that are commenting on the conflict between the Stuarts and the Hanoverian dynasty, which would be passed around and read. And if you weren't a Jacobite strictly, you might still read one of these poems and laugh at it or kind of make fun at either the Hanoverians or the Stuarts. So it's much more of a blurred line, I think, often than the idea of a two-sided debate suggests. Song is another one. So song, ballads were recording the events, commenting on the individuals involved, celebrating them afterwards. And I think through all these different networks, then news travels and people get a sense of what's going on. In terms of people like the Duchess, I think we have to remember that the social elite circle at this time is relatively small. So it wouldn't necessarily be surprising if one of the Duchess's friends happened to be married to a Jacobite or was herself a Jacobite. So again, the people who are pro-Stuart and pro-Hanoverian actively, and then those who are not necessarily as active, are mingling together quite a bit.
Moving a little bit back to Alnwick. Alnwick Castle at the time of the 1715 and 1745 rebellions was in a state of disuse, but did castles elsewhere play their parts in the Jacobite era and their supporters?
Again, I'm not necessarily a military historian, so I'm not clued up so well on the sort of strategy, but thinking about castles in Scotland in particular, the idea of a castle as a kind of strategic point and maybe a fortified place. Edinburgh Castle and Stirling Castle were key in both 1715 and 1745 rising. In the 1715 and 1745, the Jacobite army attempted unsuccessfully to take Stirling. And in 1715, there's a kind of farcical attempt at taking Edinburgh Castle by climbing up a rope ladder around the side, and they had managed to get one of the guards on side, so he was going to let them all come through and help them get up. And because the supposed leader of this rising, was sat in the pub drinking too long, they waited and waited, and eventually they just went ahead of it. By that point it was too late, and the next watch was coming round who was not on the side of the Jacobites, so they had to abandon their plans. In 1745, the Jacobites succeeded in taking the city of Edinburgh, but what's interesting is they actually never took the castle still. They just managed to hold the city, and they held court at Holyrood instead. So those are the kind of more traditional strategic uses of castles. But obviously moving through the country, not necessarily castles, but these elite houses, these large manor houses of sometimes supporters, sometimes people who were completely against the Jacobite army, but they just marched in and took the estate anyway and demanded that they were able to stay at the castle. These were important points on the road for the army, travelling through the country, whether that's to get to a meeting point or just to try and get further south to take up more control. And those who supported Jacobites would often, welcome them in. They would house them, feed them, make sure the army was well fed. The elite leaders, they would have a nice bed to sleep in and wash their clothes. And so not necessarily in terms of strategic points to hold, but in terms of places on the journey and places to stop at, these houses were important. One quite well-known story, though, from the 1745 took place at Moy Hall near Inverness. So this is not that too long before the Battle of Culloden. And Charles Edward Stuart was staying at Moy Hall when alert was raised that the government forces had heard about this and were on their way to take him, to take the hall and to capture the prince. And Lady Mackintosh, who was the resident of Moy Hall, was her home. She was a Jacobite. She said, "Don't worry, we'll do something about this." And it's quite a famous account in that just a few men who were around went outside in the dark and they sort of fired their guns in all sorts of different directions and ran about to make it sound like there was a whole troop of Jacobite army there, even though there were only a few of them. And the government forces who were approaching, they were scared off and ran away. And they only sort of heard later on that they had been fooled. So that's one story to do with a sort of castle or house beyond the strategic taking of points of power.
Now, a figure who probably wouldn't have been scared off, who was quite important in the Battle of Culloden, is the Duke of Cumberland. And he passed through Alnwick in January 1746, dined here on his way to Scotland. Can you tell us a little bit about him and the part he played in ending this second rising in the 1740s?
Yes, and that's another great example of the idea of, the troops passing through and the commander or elite person would go and stay within the castle and be hosted and well fed and treated. And I'm sure the Duke of Cumberland was at Alnwick. So the Duke of Cumberland, or William Augustus, was the third and youngest son of the Hanoverian or the British king, George II. He was born in 1721, which makes him about the same age as Charles Edward Stuart. So they're quite interesting counterparts when it comes to the 1745 rising, these young princes kind of fighting for their claim to the throne or for their family's claim to the throne. The Duke of Cumberland had already proved himself as an army commander in the Wars of the Austrian Succession on the side of the Austrian Netherlands, although he didn't really succeed in what he'd set out to do. He was generally seen to be a good general. And he was called back then to lead the British army against the Jacobite rebels at some point later in 1745. And he kind of raced up to catch up with the army up the east coast and eventually stopped for some time in Aberdeen to train up some troops, discipline them, and from there further up towards Nairn, Inverness area, where ultimately the Jacobite and the government army met at Drumossie Moor. So this was the sort of, in the end, we know with hindsight, the pitched battle that ended the Jacobite rebellion of 1745 and ultimately put a stop to the Jacobite cause as a whole, any real chance of succession of a Stuart restoration. And so I won't necessarily go into the details of the Battle of Culloden, but there the troops met and the Jacobites were defeated. And after that, the Jacobite army and Highland society kind of more generally was actually really harshly treated. There was a lot of killing of Jacobite soldiers, destroying of crops and imprisoning anyone who had helped Jacobites or was seen to be harbouring fleeing soldiers. So while he was popular to some as kind of the hero who put down this rebellion, the Duke of Cumberland quickly was called also Butcher Cumberland, and that's a name that kind of has stuck with him since 1746 and throughout the rest of history. Maybe didn't help that the two princes were contrasted visually often in satire. So the Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, his name, he was considered generally to be very attractive. He was quite tall. He seems to have been slim from the portraits, whereas the Duke of Cumberland is quite a portly figure and very round. And so maybe didn't help with this name, Butcher, being attached to him because of their difference in appearance.
You've obviously explained a lot of information about Jacobites, who they were, where they came from. But if people would like to know a little bit more about them, where would you suggest they look?
Yeah, I mean, there are, first of all, loads of great books about the Jacobites that you'll probably find either by searching Jacobites online or in your local library. the things I'm interested in, for example, the material culture of the Jacobites. So Neil Guthrie and Murray Pittock are some of the authorities on Jacobite material culture. In terms of the 1715 rising relating to the Earl of Derwentwater, more specifically, Daniel Secchi has written a book just called 1715, you'll find it. And also NMS, National Museum of Scotland, where I work, recently did an exhibition on the Jacobites, and they produced a catalogue that includes essays as part of that. So you might want to check that out. And then, there are loads of resources online. NMS has some pages. Go and look at your local museum or your local archive and see what you can find about them, because I think partly the story is an attractive one, and lots of places have some kind of connection that they claim to the history, so you can often find it.
All that remains to say is thank you very much for joining us on the podcast and telling us all about the Jacobites.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So I feel like we've learned a lot about Jacobites from talking to Georgia.
Yes, I feel like I know a huge amount more than I did, which was barely anything, if I'm honest.
Definitely. And we know that we've got those small but quite important connections to some of the major figures as well.
Mm-hmm. If you would like to find out more, we can recommend a trip to the National Museum of Scotland, where their Scottish history and archaeology galleries have some amazing items on display.
And we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast. Any reviews, ratings, or recommendations you can leave on your podcast platform of choice will be much appreciated. And you can let us know what you think by emailing us on podcast@alnwickcastle.com.
On the next episode, we'll be returning to the Gunpowder Plot. I spoke to the creators of a new musical starring plotter and former Constable of Alnwick Castle, Thomas Percy. Please do join us for that, but until then, I've been Deborah.
And I've been Daniel.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.